It was an unseasonably warm February day in 2017 in the small rural town of Delphi, Indiana. It's not a place where you worry about your teenage kids deciding to go on an adventure. So when Abby Williams and her best friend Libby German decided to go on a hike near the Monon High Bridge in the middle of the day, no one thought it was dangerous. But when Libby and Abby did not show up when they were supposed to get picked up, their families began to worry and they began to search. Then the next day, the worst news possible. The bodies of these two young girls were found, both victims of murder. As the investigation progressed over 5 years, there were sketches of the suspect that looked like two different people, and there was video of the killer. Then finally, an arrest of the accused murderer, Richard Allen. Allen says he didn't do it, and he also alleges it was a group of Odinites who are responsible. White nationalists practicing an ancient Nordic religion. This case has also been buried in legal controversy involving Richard Allen's attorneys who were on the case, off the case and replaced, and then back on the case. Tonight, we'll speak with one of his replacement attorneys about Allen's innocence, his treatment while in custody, and Odinism as we continue our investigation of the Delphi murders.
I'm Vinny Politan. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Abby and Libby were best friends, and when I think about what happened to them and the moments of terror that they went through, the fact that two were murdered doubles the tragedy, obviously, but for each one of them, at least they weren't alone, right? I mean, that's a small consolation. But it reminds me of what we're dealing with out in Idaho with Kaylee and Maddie, best friends, who were also murdered when they were together. It's incredible loss for two families. And now having to go through everything that they've gone through. This is almost unconscionable, the point that we're at now for the victims. It took 5 years for Richard Allen to be arrested. This was a guy who spoke with someone, gave a statement like the day of or the day after, saying he was there. And that in part became the basis for what they did like 5 years later in investigating him and executing a search warrant of his home. All things that could have been done easily within the first month of this investigation. He said he was there. And they had some video image of the person who was there that they were able to retrieve. So at least at that point, they're like, oh, all right, we've got a video of the killer. Well, who was there that day, guys? I mean, it didn't happen. I can't believe it. But he's been arrested. Now, obviously, he says he's completely innocent and did not do this. And he gets the presumption of innocence. And his original attorneys, who are fighting tooth and nail on this one and also believe in his innocence, are back on the case, Baldwin and Rosie. These two guys have been very aggressive in their defense of Richard Allen. Not a popular position to be in, right? This is the highest profile case, went unsolved for years, horrific murder, and you're representing the accused killer. You're not going to be popular, but they want in on this case. They want to do it. They believe in his innocence. So that's a significant factor in all of this, because this isn't going to be one of those cases where the defense rolls over. And we've had a few trials like that here on Court TV, where people, the evidence is overwhelming and, you know, the defense does their thing but doesn't really do their thing. Completely different in this case. So tonight we have a Court TV exclusive, because as you know, there have been different lawyers representing Richard Allen at different times. And one of them, William Lebrato, who was one of the replacement lawyers, is now off the case, but spoke exclusively with Court TV. And joining me in studio, senior producer of Court TV documentaries, Barbara McDonald, who did that interview. Barbara, great to see you. How did this all come about?
I have reached out to him before asking for an interview. He was under the gag order while he was on the case. As soon as that Supreme Court decision came down, I reached out again. he said, yeah, I want to talk now. So we set it up. I flew up to Fort Wayne, and we sat down and talked.
So big picture, after sitting down and speaking with him, what was your biggest takeaway from the whole thing?
How I think bothered he is by this case and the treatment that Richard Allen is receiving while he's being held in a maximum security prison pending trial, the role of potential Odinism in this case, and he believes that Richard Allen is innocent.
Wow. Okay, so let's do this. Let's get to that interview. Folks at home like, Vinny, will you play the interview? Yes, we will. Let's take a listen. Now, this is the part where you're talking about his innocence,
yes.
Right? And folks at home know the difference in our legal world between believing your client's innocent and believing that the other side doesn't have enough evidence to prove that he's guilty. Those are two different things. Two different things. He believes he's innocent. Let's take a listen.
Bradley Rosie and Andrew Baldwin issued a press release not too long into their getting the case, and they said they believe that Richard Allen is innocent. Do you have an opinion on that?
I do. I don't think Mr. Allen had anything to do with this. I honestly don't. Now, what I believe, nobody cares. My job would have been to convince 12 jurors of that.
You're a defense attorney, so that's your job to sort of say your client is innocent. Is that something you say about all your clients?
No, and rarely do I believe it. But in this particular case, I believe it 100%.
And what convinced you?
Conversations with him, the fact that he lived in this very small community that's not much bigger than a high school. He worked at the CVS in Delphi. The police sketches are hung up in the CVS. The bridge guy picture is in the CVS. And in 5.5 years, no one comes into that store and says that kind of looks like you. And I don't know if this has any relevance, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but an arrest was made 27 days before a sheriff election. Just my humble opinion that played some kind of role in his arrest.
So
And he hadn't moved. He hadn't changed his story. No facts or evidence have changed, to my knowledge, that brought law enforcement back to him 5.5 years later. He has no criminal record. They raided his house, took all of his social media. There's no ties to this Odinism cult whatsoever. He didn't even know that there was Odinism in Delphi. He had never heard of it. Just a lot of things don't make sense.
Bradley Rosie and Andrew Baldwin also said that there's no electronic evidence linking him to the crime scene or the girls, and that there's no DNA of his at the scene. Is that accurate?
Yes, as far as I can tell, yes.
All right, we're going to bring in some more guests to join me and Barbara here. Joining us in Orange County, California, the author of Forest for the Trees, a book about the Delphi murders, investigative producer Chris Todd. And in Salt Lake City, Utah, retired police commander, religious cult expert, host of the Profiling Evil podcast, and the author of the book Deceived, an investigation into Zion Society cult. Mike King is here. Barbara, I'll start with Barbara, though. I'm going to ask her a quick question. The fact here that you're asking him about, he believes in the innocence. What was the sense you're getting in the room with him?
That he felt that. He was very sincere, I thought. His answers were careful and deliberate, but I thought he was sincere and he believed what he was saying.
Chris Todd, you investigated this thing. One of the things that he points out, for 5 years, the pictures of the sketches of the killer that don't look alike, but that's another story, right? The picture of the actual video grab are in the CVS where this guy's working, and no one's putting two and two together. What are your thoughts about why the arrest of Richard Allen in that time frame?
Well, we've talked about this before, and I don't believe Richard Allen is Bridge Guy. And I believe that's what we're all talking about here, is how would no one recognize him, his voice, his body type, his height? How would nobody know that it's him? I don't believe he is Bridge Guy. I've stated who I believe that is. I'm not going to say it this second, but I do believe Richard Allen is involved. I just don't think he's on the bridge.
And that gets us to a whole nother place, right? That he's not alone in doing all of this. All right, Mike King, here's the evidence, right? Because he's arrested because they believe they have evidence in the case. It's not like, oh, let's just, hey, he's at CVS, let's get that guy. Richard Allen told police he was on the trail the day Abby and Libby went missing. Richard Allen's description of the clothing he was wearing that day matches the clothing of the suspect in the video on the victim's phone. A vehicle resembling Allen's 2016 Ford Focus was observed near the trail around 1:30. And the Indiana State Police Lab determined an unspent round found near the victim's bodies had been cycled through Richard Allen's Sig Sauer model P226, which apparently he kept for all those years, according to prosecutors. Your thoughts about the strength of that case based on that evidence?
I think that it really is important and really strong, Vinny. I mean, you got to take into account, how can all these things happen? And we've talked about circumstantial evidence in these kinds of cases before. And I don't know whether Richard Allen's responsible for this or not, but I do know that you just named 5 things that are incredibly coincidental that he would happen to be in the same place at the same time. And when we get to see the ballistics on this unspent round that was cycled through, I don't know if that means that it's an artifact of scraping on the sides of the cartridge itself that is the artifact. If there was an actual attempt to fire that bullet and there's indentations on the firing pin, but it was a misfire, it's going to be really important when that thing comes into court and there are both sides shouting out at the top of their lungs that is that kind of a comparison is of no value, and others saying it absolutely is. But if you've got markings that gun is the only gun on the earth that will make, and those end up on those cartridges that are found next to the bodies, that's incredibly powerful evidence.
Now, I want to put this up on the screen because there is one other piece of evidence I think is something that needs to be explained. On April 3rd, 2023, Richard Allen made a phone call to his wife, Kathy Allen, and this is while he's locked up. In that phone call, Richard Allen admits several times that he killed Abby and Libby. Investigators had the phone call transcribed, and the transcription confirms that Richard Allen admits that he committed the murders of Abigail Williams and Liberty German. He admits several times within the phone call that he committed the offenses as charged. His wife, Kathy Allen, ends the phone call abruptly. Barbara McDonald, what did William Lebrato have to say about that?
He said he has a lot of questions about it, that his understanding is it was basically one sentence that Richard spoke, this confession, so not a lot of detail provided in that confession. And he says that Richard Allen was receiving medication while he's in prison, both shots and pills. He doesn't know what those medications were. He tried to find out. And so he has a lot of questions about what all was going on. He also says false confessions are a real thing, especially when people are subjected to very harsh prison conditions.
Yeah, the one thing about the false confession in this case, though, that we've seen him here on court TV, but it's usually under an interrogation scenario. This is a call to his wife. Mike King, your thoughts on that? Because this is going to be significant. No one has heard this thing outside of investigators, and I presume maybe at some point the defense will hear it. What are your thoughts about this confession, and what would be important about the circumstances for you surrounding it?
I think that the most important thing that comes out of this is it wasn't one confession. By every account that I've read and other testimony I've heard on different media sources, is that it was at least 5 times, maybe 6 times, that he made these confessions or admissions that he was the guy. And I think that's going to be really difficult to overcome, Vinny. You can say, okay, he might have been having a problem just before he started eating evidence and having all of this bizarre behavior. So I want to know the timing of those other 4 or 5 calls, not only just to his wife, but we also know that one of those calls was to his mother, where he explained that he was the guy.
Chris, Todd, what is it about the scene, the evidence, the story, the case that makes you believe it's more than one person?
For a long time, I thought it was just one person, and until everything started to fall into place, that they arrested Richard Allen. And like I said before, the word on the street is that he had bragged about being involved in the murders, and that's how they were tipped off to him. So I always had a hunch there were possibly 2 people involved, and so I believe that one person is waiting on the property and the other person holds the girls at gunpoint, and they meet together down by the creek, and they go to a location that is not, I believe, is not the crime scene where the bodies were found.
All right, our guests are staying with us. We'll continue with more of our Court TV exclusive interview with Richard Allen's former attorney who was on the case and has a lot to say on this. We're going to talk about Odinism. Odinism, that is such a huge theme in all of this. Plus, coming up next hour.
In Oakland County, Michigan, high drama in the courtroom. Jennifer Crumbley has been charged with 4 counts of homicide for 4 murders committed by her son, the Oxford school shooter. Today, a firefighter who Jennifer was having an affair with testified about some critical text messages.
They didn't see him as a threat, and he could stay in school, which he wanted to do. His backpack was with him. Why didn't they search it?
Mother of a convicted school shooter now faces charges herself.
Involuntary manslaughter and 4 counts of it.
Both James and Jennifer Crumbley failed to ask their son if he had his gun.
This is beyond neglect. It's unforgivable.
The first parents in America to be charged in a mass school shooting. This is brand new territory.
The school shooter mom trial. Live coverage weekday mornings, 8/7 Central on Court TV.
Say, we know who did it. It was the Odinist. What's an Odinist? Like, before I started covering this case, I never heard of an Odinist. I never heard of Odinism. And apparently it's, depending upon who you ask, it's ancient Norse religion, predates Christianity, where they, Odin is the god, but it's sort of been hijacked by white nationalists. So it has this sort of evil spin-off where it's a legit religion on the one hand by some people, and then sort of hijacked on the other hand by others. So that's what they're saying. This was a ritualistic killing, like a sacrifice. Sick stuff. So Barbara McDonald, a Court TV senior producer and a Court TV exclusive, sat down with Richard Allen's former attorney, his replacement counsel, William Lebrato. And here's what he had to say about Odinism.
You had not heard of Odinism when it first was floated with regard to this case?
I honestly thought, I was like, no disrespect to Mr. Baldwin and Mr. Rosie, because they're excellent lawyers. I thought it was hocus pocus. I honestly didn't, I'd never heard of it. And the more I got into it, that's a real thing. It is a real thing, and it's scary.
In what way?
Well, I believe they sacrificed a girl and killed another one. Some of the people that live in Delphi were very brazen about their Odinistic beliefs on their Facebook pages and other social media accounts, including the sergeant who was in charge of keeping Mr. Allen safe in Westville. It's real. Just the other day, Robert and I were going to lunch, and we saw a Jeep Wrangler right here in Fort Wayne with a spare tire on the back, and the cover said Odin, and it had all Odin spears like around on the cover. I would have never known what that meant and outside of this case. So Mr. Baldwin and Mr. Rosie were onto something right away.
You described one of those officers that's mentioned in one of Rosie and Baldwin's filings, Sergeant Jones, who was wearing patches that said, "In Odin We Trust," on his Department of Corrections uniform.
Yep.
The judge ordered the warden to make them stop. And then what did you notice?
That Mr. Jones had it tattooed under his right eye. From the best we can tell, it looks a lot like Odin's spear. And he had several tattoos on his forearms, including the interlocking triangles that are on his Facebook post. I got to give credit to Mr. Rosie and Mr. Baldwin that, they picked up on that. We saw him, and, confinement officers at the Allen County Jail aren't even allowed to have facial hair, let alone facial tattoos. I was a little miffed that the warden allowed that, or, he even knew what it was.
He looks a little scared talking about Odinism. I mean,
I don't know if he was scared. I know that he was being very careful with his words. As an attorney, he wanted to be sure that what he said was what he meant. But yeah, I think he probably does feel a little intimidation by it. He said it's a scary thing. And once you begin to become aware of it and you see it more often, he might not have known what that tattoo was had this issue not already been raised.
so the concept of the Odinist, I mean, there was a task force trying to solve this case, and this isn't like the defense just scraped this up. It came from the task force. There was a faction of the task force that was going down this road and believed in this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that the allegation from all these defense attorneys is they didn't do a very good job of ruling it in or out, and that there were people who had ties to Odinism who should have been checked out further and weren't.
All right, let's bring back in our guest, Chris Todd, investigative producer Mike King, religious cult expert. Chris, I'll begin with you. I get back to this conversation about Odinism. It's going to be a part of this trial. There is no doubt in my mind. The defense has said so much. There was part of the task force was going down this road. Did you come across anything associated with this? Was it on the radar?
Very early on, loosely, it was talked about, like kind of rumor mill, but I think this Odin stuff is kind of like Nazism, to be honest. And if you really look at that logo, I see like a swastika almost inside there. So I'm just saying, like, I think it's, to quote the prosecutor, I think it's colorful, and I think it's an interesting way for these defense attorneys to talk about this. But we're looking around all again when we had somebody right in front of us very early on, and then we get to Richard Allen many years later, and it's perplexing. I don't have all the answers, but that's my quick thought on the Odin thing.
Now, Mike King, I want to put this back up on the screen, because when you and I first heard about this, we were skeptical, and then the state had to respond to the allegation made by the defense, and they said that Sergeant Redacted and Sergeant Redacted have worn patches that refer to Odinism. These are the people watching Richard Allen. Those patches reflect the sergeant's religious beliefs and are not associated with any kind of cult. Sergeant Redacted did not remove the patches from his vest until ordered to do so by command. And then apparently got the tattoo. All right, so Mike King, where do you see the line between religion and cult? Because I think that's significant here, because if someone's practicing the religion, they're practicing the religion. They might believe something different than we do, or something different than their neighbor believes. Everyone's entitled to practice whatever religion they want. But if you're getting into the world of cult, that raises a red flag, and to me raises a greater possibility of something bizarre like a ritualistic sacrifice. But first you got to cross the line into it being a cult. So how do you see that issue?
You know, as Barbara interviewed, I thought it was so interesting that the message that came across is every Odinist is committing murders out there, which we've had guests on the show with us here, Vinny, that you've brought in that are followers of this Odinist ideology, and they absolutely repel that idea and say, no, it's a very peaceful kind of a group of people. Every cult I've ever looked at boils down to whether it is coercive in nature or not. And so when you think about mainstream religion, the openness of mainstream religion, sometimes we could argue they're closed in mainstream religion. And then you look at cults, there are cults that probably are not very harmful, like the cults of people that follow the Dallas Cowboys. But then when you get into the ideology that's coercive, and there's coercive mind control, and there is all kinds of conspiracy attached to it, that's the kind of cult that we really worry about and that we think about when we look at cases like this. So what we have to do is we have to separate the two first and foremost and figure out if it's coercive. In my experience, after looking at hundreds and hundreds of ritual crime allegations, was that there are predators who will use religion to be a power guise, to control a victim, to get them to believe that if they don't remain quiet, something will happen mysteriously, mystically, or religiously. And it's a way to control their victim and continue to be a predator. But I go back to this idea that if this happened, and if it was a group of Odinists, that is one magnificent conspiracy to put all of this together. It is one magnificent conspiracy to get all these people that had to have been involved, that were out burning things in the woods and putting sticks on people, to get them all to remain quiet. And I guess that's the problem I have, Vinny, from an investigative standpoint.
Let me follow up really quickly on this. For it to be a cult, does there have to be like a leader or like leaders that are coercing the masses to do these things?
In most cults, you're going to see one person that all people look to, or maybe one or two that all look to, and they are the final rule. They are the one that makes the decision. And we saw this in cases that I investigated, where you have the leader who comes up with these spiritually wacky ideas, but then you have the followers who want to be the arm of the leader and go out and act it out. But in those kinds of circumstances, Vinny, there are too many tongues that know about what happened, and I just don't believe it remains as quiet as this has remained.
All right, so let me ask Barbara McDonald here on set with me. Barbara, is there any indication at this point, with this allegation of this Odinistic society or group or whatever, that there's a leader?
Not that I've heard of. I mean, there were some names that were listed in one of the filings from Bradley Rosie and Andrew Baldwin, but
not like a hierarchy, like, okay, this is the man or woman that is sort of leading our group and is saying, hey, it's time for a sacrifice or something like that.
Yeah, I think there probably is somebody filling that role, but that hasn't really been clearly defined. And how serious is this group? If this is, in fact, a group, are they people sort of playing this on weekends, or is this something they're taking very seriously?
Chris, Todd, let me ask you, in your investigations out there, did you come across any groups, per se, whether it was like, you know, a bunch of guys that got together, or the people that you think could have been involved that had friends or were, you know, interacting with others or were close to other people, anything like that?
Well, with respect to this case in particular, or in general?
In general, in that area when you were out there.
I mean, there's been talk. I know a couple of things about Richard Allen that I'm not going to say today. I'm getting a lot of information about him, about another connection to a hunter out there. And people do think that there were multiple people involved in either placing these girls there. So it is possible that there's other people in this cover-up. So I'm not ruling out this larger conspiracy, but I just don't have all the facts to really hone in on that right now.
Appreciate that. All right, everyone stay where you are. When we come back, we're going to talk about the issue that William Lebrato is probably most concerned about at this point in preparing, or when he was the attorney, in preparing for a murder trial, which is the treatment of Richard Allen while waiting for his trial.
Anna.
This is Richard Allen, and you know, he's locked up. He looks guilty there, right? Obviously. He's presumed innocent, of course. But his pretrial detention has been very, very unusual. The normal course of things is you're charged with a crime, including murder, and you don't bond out, right? You're being held. You don't go to prison, you go to your county jail. And your county jail is filled with people waiting for their trials, people who have just been arrested, some people who've been sentenced to less serious crimes, who are doing less than a year, will be in your county jail. And they have facilities for lawyers to come in and talk to their clients, etc. But the pretrial detention of Richard Allen has been very different. Allen was first put into the Westerville Correctional Facility. Take a look. And there's Westerville. He was put there first, following his request, at the request of the Carroll County Sheriff. So the sheriff of the county jail, where accused people normally are, the sheriff says, no, you got to move him to the state prison. That's bizarre. The defense filed multiple motions to have Richard Allen transferred, but they were all denied. The Department of Corrections then made the decision to move Richard Allen from Westerville to Wabash Valley Correctional in December, which is 200 miles south of Westerville Correctional. So it's far away from where everything's happening in this case. Plus the conditions therein, the allegations are that they're a little problematic, not normal, and not conducive to preparing for a big murder trial. So here's William Lebrato in his Court TV exclusive interview with our producer, Barbara McDonald, talking about Richard Allen's treatment behind bars.
We had visited him on several occasions, but you know, driving 4 hours each way was difficult. And then at Wabash, they're not set up for visitation, so we were literally in a makeshift kitchen, and he was in a cell. We had to stand 6 feet back, and he's talking through the slot where they put the tray of food through, and that's not a very conducive way to have meaningful conversations with your client. I couldn't hand him documents, I couldn't have him sign documents, and you know, I'm sure it was very difficult for him to see the videos we were showing him through that slot. So you know, I'm not criticizing the Department of Corrections. I mean, they, for whatever reason, he was moved there. They're not set up for visitation, but you can't have I couldn't have been prepared for trial even in October if that was how all the visits were going to be conducted.
And you've handled death penalty cases. Have you ever had a pre-trial defendant treated the same way as Richard Allen?
Never. Never. In my 25 years or Stremin's 25 years have we ever had a murder client held pre-trial in a maximum security facility and then was transferred from one maximum security facility to another. Never.
And in your motion to transfer, you guys described him as being treated like Hannibal Lecter.
Particularly in Westville, at least we are allowed to sit face to face across a table from him. But the way he was handcuffed and to his chest, I mean, it looked extraordinarily uncomfortable. I couldn't shake his hand. We couldn't have him sign anything. I visited clients in prison on several occasions. That was different than anything I've ever experienced before.
And the way his hands were shackled were similar to how we see him in court, right?
Yes,
Where
exactly
it's like
the same
the
way.
tops of the hands are touching.
Yes.
And it's way up high on his chest.
It's connected to a box on his chest. I've never seen that. I've never seen anyone confined in that manner before.
So why? Why do you think that is?
I don't know. He is 5'6", 120, 130 pounds. He is not a physical threat to anyone. From all accounts, he's been a model citizen because he's locked down 23 hours a day. We told the confinement officers that we wanted him unhandcuffed so we could shake his hand and maybe have him sign documents, and they weren't budging on that. And it was sad because Westville allows visits, so his wife could come see him. And they just set up a visit with his mom and dad. He was transferred to Wabash 2 days before that visit. No, I don't think one had anything to do with the other. I just think it was bad timing and a coincidence. But in Wabash, you're not allowed any visits. Obviously, attorney, but no family members.
All right, this is a little unusual. Barbara McDonald, let me ask you, the way this breaks down, right? So the defense is alleging that Odinism committed this murder. It was part of the investigation by part of that team that was investigating this, a faction of the team. And then he's moved from the normal county facility to a state prison facility, extremely unusual, and there are Odinism guards there.
There are. And not only Odinism guards there, but guards who are told stop wearing the patches, and then at least one of them comes to work with the tattoo on his face.
On his face. Mike King, this is very unusual. I mean, this is, what are your thoughts about transferring from a county facility to a state prison, number one, and then, you know, the way he's handcuffed and all the concerns, I guess, that the correctional facilities have for this pre-trial detainee?
I guess two things, Vinny, based on my experience. And the first is that I've seen inmates be moved from a county jail to a larger facility because of resources, the ability to have a better way of caring for them. When I hear this, I'm just shaking my head and wondering what on earth is so necessary in the control mechanisms that are going on. But I don't know what his behavior is otherwise. And they may have all kinds of documented reasons behind why they're having to do and take the course of action that they're taking. I also reflect on inmates that I've talked to over the years, and I've been in prison a lot of times, eating a lot of prison lasagna with killers. And I've heard them say, doing time in a county jail is a whole lot worse than doing it in a prison. And finally, I'd say I conducted a study for the Bureau of Justice where I interviewed serial killers across the United States. Every time I went in, I was able to be face-to-face with them, but I was law enforcement at the time. They might have their feet shackled to the floor. They might even have a chain and they're shackled, but they can at least move their hands up and down, and there's limited mobility. What we're seeing here on the images, Vinny, is just odd to me that they even allowed that to happen. And I have to agree with the attorneys. How on earth could you do your job?
Yeah, you're preparing for a trial. And I mean, I get it. They believe they have very strong evidence, but he still is presumed innocent under our system of justice. Chris Todd, what are your thoughts? And this is just like, they're alleging an Odinism conspiracy, and then he goes from the normal county jail to a prison where there are Odinism guards, or guards that practice heathenry, which is very close to Odinism. I don't know. Do you believe in these coincidences?
We have to remember the first judge recused himself and said that the community, there was like a bloodlust. And I can tell you from experiences with the podcasters, the sleuths, the journalists, everybody wants to get somebody on this case. These two girls were tortured and murdered, and someone's going to pay for it. I'm not big on the stuff surrounding intimidation and all that, and I get it, but someone's going to pay for this. And if he is guilty, we have to remember, because people are throwing up the signs, the world is watching, they're doing all this stuff at the crime scene, making videos. Let's not help this guy get off. If he is guilty, he needs to pay for this.
Yeah. And Barbara, how are the families doing?
You know, they're not talking publicly right now. They are honoring the gag order in the case, and I think they're just watching this prosecution, hoping that we get to a trial so that they can see for themselves what the evidence is, like the rest of us. But it's difficult, you know, every time these headlines come up, it's difficult on them. Life goes on. The friends of Abby and Libby have all grown up and gone to college, and some of them have gotten married. Kelsey's had a baby. I mean, it's very difficult. They're never going to get over the loss of these absolutely beautiful girls who were doing nothing wrong out on the trails that day.
No, they were doing everything right. Like, this is what we want our children these days to do. Get off the computers, get outside. It's a beautiful day. Go see nature. Go, you know.
And go with somebody. You're safer if you're not alone.
Exactly.
And they were together.
Barbara McDonald, a great, great job. We look forward to more of your reports on all this. And thank you to Chris Todd and Mike King as well for your insight. We really do appreciate it.